Discover the chilling connection between Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker, and his first known victim, 9-year-old Mei Leung. This story of innocence lost marks the beginning of one of America's most terrifying crime sprees. Unravel the dark psyche behind these brutal crimes, the intense manhunt that led to Ramirez's capture, and the psychological demons that drove him. Stay tuned for an unforgettable dive into the mind of a serial killer.
Mei Leung was a vibrant 9-year-old girl living in San Francisco's Chinatown when her life was tragically cut short. Born into a modest immigrant family, Mei was known for her cheerful demeanor and close bond with her family. She lived in the bustling heart of San Francisco, a city that, at the time, was unaware of the terror that was about to unfold. On April 10, 1984, Mei Leung's life ended in a way that no one could have imagined. It was a day like any other, and Mei was out playing, as she often did, in her neighborhood. However, she never returned home. Her body was later discovered in the basement of a hotel where she had been brutally assaulted and murdered. The crime scene was horrific, with evidence of both sexual assault and strangulation, indicating the brutality of the attack. At the time of her murder, Mei's case sent shockwaves through the community, but no one could have predicted that this heinous crime was the beginning of a terrifying spree by one of America's most notorious serial killers. 4 years, Mei's murder remained unsolved, a cold case that haunted the community and left her family devastated. It wasn't until years later, through the advancement of DNA technology, that her killer was identified. Richard Ramirez, who had already become infamous as the Night Stalker, was linked to Mei's murder. This revelation added a chilling chapter to Ramirez's criminal history, revealing that his reign of terror had begun even earlier than previously thought. Mei Leung's murder marked the starting point of Ramirez's spree, setting the stage for a series of brutal killings that would terrorize California. Her case underscores the vulnerability of children and the sheer randomness of Ramirez's violence, which knew no bounds or limitations. The brutality of her death also highlighted the need for advancements in forensic science, as it was DNA evidence that ultimately brought closure to her case. The impact of Mei Leung's murder extends beyond just the personal tragedy. It is a stark reminder of the dangers that lurk in even the most familiar places. Her case remains a poignant example of the importance of protecting society's most vulnerable and the critical role of law enforcement in solving such horrific crimes. Richard Ramirez, born Ricardo Leyva Munoz Ramirez on February 29, 1960, in El Paso, Texas, grew up in a troubled environment that would later shape his violent tendencies. Raised in a household plagued by domestic violence and influenced by his older cousin, Miguel, a Vietnam War veteran who exposed him to stories of torture and violence, Ramirez's childhood was marked by a desensitization to brutality. As a teenager, Ramirez began to exhibit increasingly disturbing behaviors, including drug use and a fascination with Satanism. His early criminal activities included petty theft and drug offenses, but these would escalate dramatically as he moved to California in the early 1980s. It was in California that Ramirez would earn the moniker Night Stalker, as he embarked on a terrifying crime spree that involved burglary, sexual assault, and murder. Ramirez's method was both erratic and horrifyingly effective. He would break into homes at night, often while the occupants were asleep, and subject his victims to unimaginable terror. His attacks were characterized by their unpredictability. Ramirez targeted men, women, and children of all ages, showing no mercy regardless of his victim's identity. His crimes were often marked by extreme violence, including bludgeoning, stabbing, and shooting, and were accompanied by acts of sexual assault. One of the most chilling aspects of Ramirez's crimes was his use of satanic symbols. He would leave pentagrams at crime scenes and often demanded that his victims swear to Satan before killing them. This, coupled with his erratic behavior and seemingly random selection of victims, made him a figure of immense fear in the Los Angeles and San Francisco areas during the mid-1980s. Ramirez's victims included women like Jenny Vinco, who was brutally murdered in her apartment in June 1984, and Lillian Doi, who was attacked in her home in August 1985. Each of these crimes left the community in fear, with residents bolting their doors and windows, fearful of the night and the unknown terror that could strike at any moment. The randomness of his attacks and the brutality with which he carried them out made Richard Ramirez one of the most feared serial killers in American history. His reign of terror came to an end only when a vigilant community member recognized him and alerted the police, leading to his eventual capture. The arrest of Richard Ramirez marked the end of a reign of terror that had gripped California for over a year. On August 31, 1985, Ramirez was recognized on a bus in East Los Angeles, where his image had been widely publicized in the media. His capture was a direct result of the community's vigilance, as a group of citizens chased him down and held him until the police arrived. Once in custody, Ramirez was linked to a series of murders, rapes, and burglaries through a combination of eyewitness testimony, fingerprint evidence, and stolen items found in his possession. His trial, which began on July 22, 1988, was one of the most publicized in American history, drawing significant media attention due to the gruesome nature of his crimes and his bizarre behavior in court. During the trial, Ramirez displayed no remorse for his actions. He often disrupted proceedings, flashing a pentagram drawn on his hand and shouting "Hail Satan" in the courtroom. His behavior only heightened the public's fear and fascination with him, turning the trial into a media spectacle. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence against Ramirez, including fingerprints and ballistic matches that linked him to the crime scenes. Survivors of his attacks also testified, providing harrowing accounts of their experiences. One of the most damning pieces of evidence was a footprint left at one of the crime scenes, which matched a pair of sneakers Ramirez owned. On September 20, 1989, Ramirez was convicted on 13 counts of murder, 5 counts of attempted murder, 11 counts of sexual assault, and 14 counts of burglary. The jury deliberated for 22 days before reaching a unanimous verdict. On November 7, 1989, Ramirez was sentenced to death in the gas chamber. Despite the conviction, Ramirez's trial did not bring closure for many of his victims' families. The length of the trial, combined with Ramirez's defiant behavior, only added to their pain. Moreover, Ramirez's death sentence was appealed numerous times, and he remained on death row for over 2 decades. The trial of Richard Ramirez highlighted the complexities of the American legal system, particularly in handling cases involving multiple murders and a defendant with such a public persona. His case remains a landmark in criminal justice, not only for its gruesome nature, but also for the way it was conducted and the media's role in shaping public perception. Understanding the psychological makeup of Richard Ramirez is key to comprehending the motivations behind his horrific crimes. Ramirez exhibited many traits associated with psychopathy, including a lack of empathy, narcissism, and a penchant for manipulative behavior. His early exposure to violence, both in his home and through his cousin Miguel, played a significant role in shaping his worldview and desensitizing him to the suffering of others. Ramirez's fascination with Satanism further complicated his psychological profile. His belief in satanic rituals and symbols was not just a part of his crimes, but a core aspect of his identity. This belief system gave him a sense of power and control, which he exercised through his violent acts. The use of satanic symbols in his crimes was both a method of intimidation and a personal statement of rebellion against societal norms. The lack of a stable family environment and the exposure to extreme violence at a young age contributed to Ramirez's development into a remorseless killer. His relationship with his cousin, who glorified violence and murder, introduced Ramirez to a twisted version of masculinity and power. This influence, combined with his own psychological predispositions, set him on a path toward becoming a serial killer. Ramirez's ability to compartmentalize his life was another hallmark of his psychopathy. He could engage in brutal violence and then return to everyday activities without displaying any signs of guilt or remorse. This detachment allowed him to carry out his crimes with a level of cold-blooded efficiency that shocked both his victims and law enforcement. Throughout his trial, Ramirez's behavior further highlighted his psychological disorders. His lack of remorse, combined with his erratic courtroom outbursts, pointed to a deep-seated anger and a need to assert dominance even in the face of overwhelming evidence against him. His taunting of the victims' families and his open admiration for Satan only added to the public's perception of him as a man devoid of humanity. The psychological analysis of Richard Ramirez provides a chilling insight into the mind of a serial killer. His combination of childhood trauma, exposure to violence, and inherent psychological disorders created a perfect storm that led to one of the most terrifying crime sprees in American history. Ramirez's case continues to be studied by criminologists and psychologists as a key example of how deeply ingrained psychological issues can manifest in extreme violence